The ongoing challenge of lack of affordable inner-city accommodation has been escalating. In the city of Johannesburg, there are now an estimated 181 hijacked buildings in the CBD, and residents often find themselves living in squalor. Today, Mayor Dada Morero inspected the inner-city restoration program. Let's look at ways to address the housing and the issue of hijacked buildings in CBDs. I'm now joined by Professor Amira Osman, who is a professor of architecture at the Tshwane University of Technology. Prof, a very good afternoon to you. Thanks very much for your time. The mayor, who we just had an interview with, began that interview by asking a question, or the question, how do we make inner cities, or the inner city, a better place? Can you answer that question?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I don't think any one person has the answer. I don't think any one discipline has the answer. I'm an architect by training and by profession. I also hold the position of the South African Research Chair in Spatial Transformation. So I have a very real interest in cities that are equitable, that are accessible, that offer opportunities for all of their inhabitants, irrespective of who those inhabitants are. So how to make the city, work for everyone? I have a feeling that South Africa has those answers on paper. So I just got the very last part of the mayor's interview there, where he speaks about a plan, if I'm not mistaken, that is being developed. Now, we are aware of a housing plan that was already adopted in 2017. So it seems like many other policies in South Africa, they are really good on paper, they're very progressive, and it's simply a question of putting those plans into action and making sure that the officials in power also buy into those plans and develop ways to make them a reality and translate them into tangible projects on the ground. So we need to, and we can, make cities livable, supporting the lives and the livelihoods of everyone involved. And there are ways to do that, but how do we get to a stage of where we actually acknowledge those plans, not reinvent the wheel, but build on what we already have? That would be my response for now. Thank you.
But then, how do we... we may have the 2017 plan, which, as you say, was good and progressive. But then, when you look at what is there, currently, let's look at the Marshalltown building that caught fire, and seven lives were lost there. And we look at the gas leaks in De Kort and Bree Streets. You look at the fact that there's 181 buildings that have been hijacked in the CBD. Now, someone would say, those are the basics. We haven't gone, we're still talking about looking after what is there currently before we even begin to talk about the future.
Thank you so much for that. I always believe that we need to do what is immediate. We need emergency interventions, and those can't be delayed at all. While we're doing that, we need to have a larger, longer-term vision. So without any doubt, we are needing to address issues of making sure that there's emergency services to the critical buildings, that we are able to provide things like fire hydrants, like fire escapes, clearing routes outside of those buildings, and negotiating that with the residents, with the NGOs, with the occupiers of the buildings, as possibly with the owners of the buildings. I also believe that we need to know exactly what is owned by the city. so that the city can then help implement or initiate that process of intervening with those emergency measures. And there are buildings where such measures have happened in collaboration with both the residents and NGOs that operate in areas. So while I'm looking at that longer term vision and I'm leading people to that housing plan that was adopted in 2017, we still need those immediate safety interventions in a city. And for us to implement those immediate safety interventions, it requires from us to acknowledge, respect, and understand the occupiers of those buildings, their needs, and also to make a very clear distinction between the occupiers of the buildings and the illegal hijackers who are benefiting from those occupiers and making an income from these very poor conditions. So if we distinguish between the two, I believe we'll be in a better position to address the issues at the immediate level with the emergency interventions, as well as plan for a longer term vision that includes the current residents of the inner city.
Presumably, I mean, the plan deals with municipal land and buildings that are underutilized or that are some of it vacant, some of it underdeveloped.
Yes, it has to. It has to be. It has to be a holistic approach. I think one of our failings in South Africa is that we often think of housing as housing for the poor, and then the middle class or the wealthier segments of society can sort that out themselves. But I truly believe that we need to think in terms of a housing ecosystem that creates a better urban environment for everyone, rich or poor, and then the poor become an integral part of that housing ecosystem. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was Lindiwe Sisulu who said that she is not the minister of low-income housing, she is the Minister of Housing. So in a city, we need a mix of housing opportunities that caters for all income levels. There will, of course, be segments of society that needs additional support. And one of the things that we have often argued for is that the residents of occupied buildings in the inner city have been there for so many years. We have worked with people that have been there 10 years, 20 years, closer to 30 years. So why do we not redirect some of the government funding, subsidies, create a subsidy for that, and direct some of the government funding into that, but at the same time be encouraging and creating a supportive environment for the private sector to participate. So you end up having a mix of income levels, a mix of functions within the same areas in the inner city, where it is not really possible to distinguish between the rich and the poor. One of our biggest problems, of course, as everyone knows, in South Africa is we still remain with the apartheid city structure, where lower income housing, social housing is visible, it's located in particular locations, and it's easily distinguishable from other forms of housing. We need various housing opportunities to be offered in a city with various stakeholders, various sources of funding. And we still, I reiterate, have to do that, taking into consideration the current residents of the inner city, because they currently make the inner city, and they've been there long enough to create very strong communities within the inner city. And as long as we continue to criminalize that activity, it's very difficult for us to do neither the immediate emergency interventions of just opening up emergency exits and making sure that they have fire extinguishers. We won't do that if we don't change our attitude towards the residents of those buildings. And we also won't be able to implement that longer term vision, which creates a beautiful, thriving, mixed use inner city environment for everyone.
A quick one, Prof, just to finish off this conversation. You're talking about the ideal housing ecosystem. Over the years, we've seen instances where the government would say, we want to bring sort of lower income housing for certain categories of people, closer to where they work and often closer to where people who earn higher incomes and who buy or build their own homes are, who then take that to mean that such moves will then cheapen, in their homes and suburbs. That has been a big part of the conversation over the years, hasn't it?
Yes, so if I'm not mistaken, you're specifically referring to social housing, which in South Africa is defined as subsidized rental housing. And there's a condition there that to get the subsidy and to implement the housing stock, you need to be in a good location. It can't be in a peripheral area away from income generating opportunities. Now, the tricky thing about social housing in South Africa is it still does not cater for the very poor. So we need to innovate more and create opportunities for the very poor. We need to acknowledge people that work in this space. So there's many organizations that we could learn from nationally, but also internationally, that work in this space of providing for the very low income groups. I think I've mentioned NGOs a few times that work in this space. We need to refer to things like faith-based organizations that have also been active in the housing space. We need innovative and just solutions to this crisis. And one of our biggest problems, again, in South Africa is we like to be very self-referential. We look at the conditions in South Africa and we neglect to look at global examples. What we need to do in a city, as well as the government, perhaps making public and sharing exactly what properties it owns in the city. We also need to document people that are already there, the opportunities for renovation that are already there, the existing commercial and retail space, acknowledging informal activities that are already there, and then set up these networks of academics, community leaders, NGOs, etc., and to really engage with the residents in those buildings, and hopefully to start thinking of these places not as dirty, backward, messy, overcrowded, but to look at them as places where new opportunities can arise, and to look at global examples of where this has happened. This is not just unique to South Africa.
Innovative and just solutions. Professor Osman, thank you very much for your time and insights.